Appomattox Courthouse was the scene of the final battle of the Civil War. It's where Confederate General Lee was trying desperately to escape Richmond and get back to some kind of rail line. He had been moving away from Richmond after being forced out, trying to get to Lynchburg or Danville to get desperately needed supplies from Carolina. Uh, Unfortunately, General Grant was stopping him from just about every vital line because Lee had to get to a rail yard for supplies and to get his army out of there. And so, as they marched along the Lynchburg Turnpike, seen here, they had to constantly fight against the Union. Here, the Union would have been coming down this road, and the Confederates would be desperately trying to stop them. While on the reverse side, seen here, the Confederates would be marching towards Appomattox, trying to get to the vital train station. So Lee had divided up his men on the north and south of the road. Meanwhile, he was in a thicket where he had his headquarters. This was his headquarters for a few days in end of April, or the beginning of April. And on April 9th, they found that in the north, Confederate or Union soldiers were bearing down on them. But they were still unblocked to the south until all of a sudden they start to see a large Union force show up, blocking themselves from Appomattox Station. So General Longstreet here had the task of holding out in the north, keeping the Union at bay, while in the south, Lee is going to make one final last battle to get to that Appomattox Courthouse station. But he realized that there were far more Union troops than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just simple cavalry under General Sheridan here. It was, in fact, far more infantry backing up. So as the fighting unfurled, Lee realized that he was trapped on both sides. He was desperate of supplies. The Appomattox River to north cut him off. And as much as General Gordon and the Confederates tried to hold out, they could not break through the lines. And on the very early of April 9th, after the failed Confederate attack, as Lee and Grant had been corresponding, Lee knew that he had to surrender. So he had to Grant allowed the Confederates to pick a site. This is Appomattox Courthouse itself. This is the town leading up to it on the Lynchburg Road. The Confederates picked this area. It was an unusual move to have your surrendering, the defeated enemy pick the place. The courthouse here is a total reconstruction. It was demolished years ago, but the small town does remain. This would have been the scenes of some fighting as General Gordon was holding out against General Sheridan and General Ord's troops in the south. The town still exists and would have been very lively even with all the Confederate commotion going on. The Confederates picked a house just west of this under the ownership of Wilmer McLean, who had moved from Manassas, where's Wilmer, and he was trying to get away from the war, but it turned out the war would follow him. They picked his house. He reluctantly agreed to have this meeting in his parlor. And on the morning of April 9th, after the attack had failed, Lee and Grant came here. Grant was a little bit late arriving at the house. Lee had to sort of wait on the front porch for a while, waiting for Grant to show up. It must have been very pensive for Lee, knowing that this could basically be his last moment that he would see his men or be alive, because he can be considered a traitor. So when Lee and Grant met, they talked a while about the Mexican War. Grant was not really excited to get to the matters at hand, but when they finally did, Lee was very nervous, but Grant basically gave them very lenient terms. It was under orders from Lincoln, and basically said, if your men go home, that's it. The parlor itself, most of this furniture was taken immediately by Union troops after the war. I mean, they paid the McLeans, but they still took it. So this is a recreation. But Lee was able to go back to his lines on April 9th to kind of look over and finalize everything. Their men could just lay down their weapons and go home. They weren't going to be tried or anything like that, and he wasn't going to be put in jail either. So very early the next day, on April 10th, they would meet up here. This is just north of Appomattox itself in a field. And Lee professed that he could not get other armies to surrender like Grant had hoped, but otherwise agreed to every term. And he also desperately needed supplies. This is what it looks like today. It's memorialized. It's right off the Lynchburg Pike, and along that pike on April 12th, a couple days later, the Confederates led their troops. General Gordon was the only one really willing to lead the Confederate troops as they marched along this road coming south towards Appomattox. And the Union troops saluted them. The Union troops under Chamberlain gave them that courtesy of a surrendering army, which went a long way to helping that peace that Lincoln so desperately wanted, that healing phase. So when the Confederate soldiers laid down their weapons, they were able to simply go back and promise not to take up arms against the North again. The generals met and talked, and then they went back to their respective capitals, where absolute celebration erupted. Lee had finally surrendered. This war, while technically not over, was truly on its way to ending, and it all happened on a quiet little Appomattox courthouse in Western Virginia, and it's essentially where the Civil War would come to end.